It was a bright and sunny afternoon in a small suburban town, the kind of day where everything feels calm and life seems predictable. But for young Marcus, a 15-year-old boy with a love for basketball and big dreams of becoming an engineer, this day would be anything but ordinary. Marcus was walking home from the local park, his basketball tucked under one arm, his headphones playing his favorite playlist. He had just finished shooting hoops with his friends and was in a good mood, thinking about how he nailed his last three-pointer. He was wearing a navy blue polo shirt, jeans, and sneakers, nothing out of the ordinary. As he strolled down the street, he noticed a police car slowly driving past him. He didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't uncommon to see officers patrolling the neighborhood. But this time, something felt different. The car suddenly stopped, and two officers stepped out, their eyes fixed on Marcus. "Hey, you," one of them called out. Marcus froze, unsure of why they were addressing him. He took off his headphones, his heart starting to race. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, walked closer, sizing him up. "We've had reports of someone matching your description causing trouble around here," he said. Marcus was confused. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had been at the park all afternoon, and there was no way he could have been involved in whatever they were talking about. "I think you've got the wrong person," Marcus said politely, trying to keep calm. But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The second officer, younger but just as intimidating, stepped forward. "Empty your pockets," he demanded. Marcus hesitated, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. "Why?" "I didn't do anything," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. The older officer's expression hardened. "Don't make this harder on yourself, kid." Marcus slowly set his basketball down and turned his pockets inside out, revealing nothing but the house key and a few crumpled dollar bills. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy the officers. The younger one grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back, and slapped on a pair of handcuffs. "Wait, what are you doing? I didn't do anything." Marcus protested, panic setting in. Passers-by began to stop and watch, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. A few people murmured among themselves, but no one stepped in to help. As Marcus stood there, handcuffed and humiliated, he couldn't help but wonder why this was happening to him. Was it because of the color of his skin? The thought made his stomach churn. He had always been taught to respect authority, but at this moment, he felt powerless and alone. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Marcus saw a familiar figure approaching. It was a tall man in a tailored black suit, walking with purpose. His face was calm, but his eyes held a fire that made everyone around him take notice. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. It was his father. The officers didn't seem to notice the man at first. They were too busy searching Marcus's backpack, looking for something, anything, that could justify their actions. But as the man got closer, his commanding presence was impossible to ignore. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The older officer looked up, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Step back, sir. This doesn't concern you," he said dismissively. But the man didn't budge. Instead, he pulled out a badge from inside his jacket and held it up. The gold glint of the badge caught the sunlight, and the words engraved on it made the officers' faces go pale. Marcus's father wasn't just any man. He was a high-ranking federal agent. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The officers exchanged nervous glances, realizing they had just made a huge mistake. Marcus, still handcuffed, looked at his father with a mix of relief and awe. He had always known his dad's job was important, but he had never seen him wield his authority like this. "I asked you a question," his father said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The younger officer stammered, thought he matched the description of a suspect, but his excuse sounded weak, even to himself. Marcus's father's gaze hardened. "So your first instinct was to handcuff a kid walking home. Did you even bother to ask him any questions?" The officers were silent, that earlier confidence completely gone. As Marcus stood there, watching his father calmly but firmly put the officers in their place, he felt a surge of pride. But he also felt anger at the fact that this had happened in the first place. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, something that needed to change. And as his father demanded that the handcuffs be removed immediately, Marcus knew this was a moment neither he nor the officers would ever forget. The handcuffs clicked open, and Marcus rubbed his wrists, the marks still fresh from the tight metal restraints. He shot a quick glance at his father, whose piercing gaze remained locked on the two officers. The crowd that had gathered was silent now, their earlier murmurs replaced by the weight of what they were witnessing. Some had lowered their phones, realizing this was no ordinary encounter. Marcus's father turned to him, his voice soft but steady. "Are you okay, son?" he asked. Marcus nodded, still shaken, but he felt safer now with his dad standing beside him. He knew his father was a man who didn't back down, someone who had spent his entire career fighting for what was right. But even he wasn't expecting to have to fight for his own son on a peaceful afternoon like this. The officers shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his father's scrutiny. "We made a mistake," the older one finally admitted, his voice low. It was a weak apology, and everyone around them could feel it. Marcus's father didn't reply immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the officers, his badge still visible in his hand. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice calm, but with an edge that made both men flinch. "Your mistake was assuming my son was a threat because of how he looks. Your mistake was treating him like a criminal without a shred of evidence. Do you understand the kind of damage that does, not just to him, but to the community you're supposed to serve?" The officers looked down, their earlier bravado completely gone. The younger one opened his mouth as if to speak but thought better of it. Marcus's father let the silence hang for a moment, his words sinking in not just for the officers but for everyone watching. He turned back to Marcus, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's go," he said firmly, guiding his son away from the scene. The crowd parted as they walked, some people offering nods of support, others still stunned by what they had just witnessed. As they made their way down the street, Marcus couldn't hold back his questions any longer. "Dad," he began hesitantly, "why did they do that to me? I didn't do anything wrong." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of the experience catching up to him. His father sighed deeply, his jaw tightening. "Son, there are people in this world who will judge you before you even open your mouth, just because of the color of your skin. It's not right and it's not fair, but it's a reality we have to face." Marcus looked up at him, searching for answers. "But you work with the police. You always said they're supposed to protect us. How can they treat people like that?" His father stopped walking and turned to face him, his expression heavy with a mix of anger and sadness. "Not all police officers are like that," he said carefully. "But there are some who let their biases cloud their judgment. And when that happens, it's people like you who pay the price." Marcus nodded slowly, trying to process everything. He had heard stories like this before, seen videos online of similar incidents, but he never thought it would happen to him. It was a harsh wake-up call, one that left him feeling both vulnerable and determined. They walked in silence for a while until they reached their house. Marcus's mother was waiting by the door, her face filled with worry. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to hug her son. She could tell something was wrong just by looking at him. His father quickly explained the situation, his tone steady but laced with frustration. Marcus's mother listened intently, her grit on her son tightening as the story unfolded. When his father finished, she shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "This has to stop," she said firmly, her voice shaking slightly. "Our son shouldn't have to live in fear just for walking down the street." Marcus's father nodded, his expression hardening. "It will stop," he said, "but it's going to take more than just words. This is why I do what I do. This is why we can't stay silent." That evening, as Marcus sat in his room, he replayed the day's events in his mind. He thought about the officers, their tone, their assumptions, and the way they looked at him. But most of all, he thought about his father, how he had stepped in and turned the situation around with just his presence. Marcus had always admired his dad, but today he saw him in a new light. He realized the weight his father carried, not just as a federal agent, but as a black man navigating a world filled with prejudice. It wasn't just about protecting his family, it was about fighting for something bigger. The next day, Marcus's father made a few phone calls. He wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it came to his family. He contacted the police department, demanding an explanation and accountability. He also reached out to a local community leader, someone who had been advocating for police reform for years. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," he told Marcus later that evening. "What happened to you was wrong, but we can use this moment to make a difference." Marcus listened intently, feeling a spark of hope amidst the anger and confusion. He didn't fully understand what his father had planned, but he trusted him. He knew his dad wasn't just a man who reacted, he was a man who took action. As the days passed, word of the incident spread throughout the community. People started talking about what had happened, sharing their own experiences and frustrations. It became clear that Marcus's story wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed. Marcus began to see himself not just as a victim, but as a voice for change. With his father's guidance, he started speaking out, sharing his story with others. It wasn't easy. Reliving the experience was painful, but he knew it was important. Through it all, Marcus's father stood by him, offering support and wisdom. "You have a voice, Marcus," he said one evening. "And when you use it, people listen. Don't ever forget that." The tension from that day still lingered, but it was slowly transforming into something more powerful, a sense of purpose. Marcus realized that while the world could be unfair, it was also full of people willing to stand up for what's right. And with his father by his side, he knew he had the strength to be one of them. In the days that followed, the incident hung over Marcus like a storm cloud that wouldn't dissipate. At school, word had spread quickly. Some of his classmates asked him about what had happened, their eyes wide with curiosity or disbelief. Others, especially those who had faced similar experiences, gave him quiet nods of solidarity. For the first time, Marcus realized just how many people around him carried the same invisible weight he now felt. One afternoon, while sitting in the lunchroom, his best friend Tyler leaned over the table. "Man, I saw the video online," he said, his voice low but urgent. "My older brother shared it. Everyone's talking about it." Marcus looked up, startled. "The video?" he asked. Tyler nodded. "Yeah, someone in the crowd filmed the whole thing. It's all over social media now. People are mad, Marcus. Like, really mad." Marcus didn't know how to feel about that. On one hand, he was glad people were paying attention to what had happened. But on the other hand, having his most humiliating moment out there for everyone to see made him feel exposed. He had barely processed the event himself, and now it was a public spectacle. That evening, when he got home, he found his parents sitting at the kitchen table. His mom's phone was in her hand, her face a mix of concern and resolve. "The video's gone viral," she said, looking at him. "People are calling and messaging us non-stop." Marcus's father leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This could be a turning point," he said. "People are paying attention. We have a chance to push for change." But not everyone who saw the video was supportive. By the next day, Marcus started noticing hateful comments popping up online. Some accused him of exaggerating the story, while others defended the officer's actions, claiming they were just doing their job. Marcus didn't understand how anyone could watch the video and still think he was in the wrong. One comment in particular stayed with him. It read, "If he wasn't doing anything wrong, why didn't he just comply?" The words echoed in his mind, making his frustration boil over. He had complied. He had done everything they asked, and it still wasn't enough. His father noticed his mood that evening as Marcus sat silently in the living room, scrolling through his phone. "Don't let those comments get to you," he said, sitting down beside him. There will always be people who refuse to see the truth. Focus on the ones who are listening. Marcus nodded but didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to shake off the negativity. It felt unfair that he had to justify his innocence while the officers who had wronged him faced no consequences. Meanwhile, his father was working tirelessly behind the scenes. He had arranged a meeting with the police department to address the incident and demand accountability. He also connected with local community leaders to organize a town hall meeting, giving people a space to share their stories and voice their concerns. The night of the town hall meeting, the community center was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the room, their expressions ranging from anger to determination. Marcus sat in the front row with his parents, feeling a mix of nerves and pride. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt targeted, silenced, or dismissed. One by one, people stood up to share their experiences. An elderly man talked about how he had been profiled decades ago and how little had changed since then. A young woman described a terrifying encounter she had with the police just last year. Each story added to the collective weight of the room, a weight that was both heartbreaking and galvanizing. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus hesitated for a moment. He looked out at the crowd, feeling the intensity of their eyes on him. But then he thought about his father's words, about using his voice. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Marcus," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "A few days ago, I was walking home when I was stopped and handcuffed by the police. They said I matched a description, but the truth is, they didn't see me. They only saw what they wanted to see, a black kid who didn't belong in their eyes." The room was silent as he spoke, every word landing with the weight of lived experience. He talked about how scared he had felt, how powerless. But he also talked about his father and how he had stepped in to defend him, not just as his dad, but as someone who believed in justice. "This isn't just about me," Marcus continued. "It's about all of us. It's about making sure no one else has to feel like I did that day." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Marcus felt a surge of relief and pride, but he also knew this was just the beginning. As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus's father pulled him aside. "You did good, son," he said, his voice filled with genuine pride. Marcus smiled, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the lingering tension. But the fight was far from over. The police department had yet to issue a formal apology or take any real accountability. And while the community was rallying behind Marcus, the road ahead was uncertain. Late that night, Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about everything that had happened, the officers, the video, the hateful comments, and the town hall. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to stay silent. Not anymore. As the days turned into weeks, the story continued to grow, drawing attention from beyond their small town. Reporters started calling, activists reached out, and the pressure on the police department increased. Marcus realized he was part of something bigger now, something that went beyond his own experience. But even as the movement gained momentum, the tension remained. The officers involved still hadn't faced any consequences, and Marcus couldn't help but wonder if justice would ever truly be served. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Change takes time, but it starts with people like you." And so, Marcus prepared himself for the road ahead, knowing it wouldn't be easy but believing it would be worth it. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind. Marcus's story had gained traction far beyond their small town, drawing national attention. News outlets picked up the viral video, and interviews with Marcus and his father became common. Everywhere they went, people stopped them to offer support or to share their own stories. The overwhelming response made Marcus feel a sense of purpose, but it also brought a new kind of pressure. The local police department, now under intense scrutiny, tried to save face by issuing a vague public statement. They acknowledged the incident, but stopped short of an apology or admitting any wrongdoing. The officers involved were still on duty, and for Marcus, that was the hardest part to accept. How could they move forward when those responsible weren't being held accountable? One evening, as Marcus sat in the living room with his parents, the phone rang. His father answered, his expression shifting as he listened to the person on the other end. After a brief exchange, he hung up and turned to Marcus and his mom. "That was one of my colleagues from the bureau," he said, his voice tense. "The department has decided to hold a closed-door meeting about the incident. They want me to come." His mom's brow furrowed. Closed door? Why not a public forum? This affects the entire community. "They're trying to control the narrative," his father replied, shaking his head. "But I'm not going to let them sweep this under the rug. I'll make sure they hear us." Marcus wanted to go with him, but his dad insisted it was something he needed to handle alone. "You've already done more than enough by sharing your story," he said. "Let me take it from here." The night of the meeting, Marcus and his mom stayed home, anxiously waiting for his father to return. Hours passed, and the tension in the house grew thicker with each minute. Marcus paced the living room, his mind racing with possibilities. Would the officers finally face consequences? Would his father be able to make them understand the damage they had caused? When his dad finally walked through the door, his expression was unreadable. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "It was heated," he said after a long pause. "They're not ready to admit fault, but the pressure is getting to them. They're considering disciplinary action against the officers, but it's not enough. Not yet." Marcus felt a mix of frustration and determination. He wanted justice, but he also knew this fight was bigger than just him. His dad's words from weeks ago echoed in his mind. Change takes time. Meanwhile, the community continued to rally. Protests were organized, with hundreds of people gathering outside the police department to demand accountability. Signs and chants filled the air, creating a powerful display of unity. Marcus attended every protest with his parents, feeling the energy of the crowd strengthen his resolve. But not everyone was supportive. Late one night, their family received an anonymous letter in the mail. It was filled with hateful language, accusing Marcus and his family of stirring up trouble. His mom read it silently before crumpling it up and throwing it away. "Cowards," she muttered, but Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. The letter was just the beginning. Over the next few days, that house became a target. Someone spray-painted the word "liars" across their front fence. Another time, they woke up to find their car tires slashed. Each incident made Marcus more aware of the dangers they faced for speaking out, but it also fueled his determination to keep fighting. One day, while scrolling through his messages, Marcus came across a note from someone claiming to have inside information about the officers involved. The message was cryptic, but it hinted at a deeper cover-up within the department. Marcus showed it to his father, who immediately contacted a trusted journalist he had worked with in the past. "This could be the breakthrough we need," his dad said, his voice laced with cautious optimism. "But we have to tread carefully. If there's more to this story, we need proof." The journalist agreed to investigate, and over the next few days, new details began to emerge. It turned out the officers who had detained Marcus had a history of complaints against them, including allegations of racial profiling and excessive force. None of the complaints had led to any significant consequences, raising serious questions about the department's accountability. When the journalist published her findings, the reaction was explosive. The story dominated headlines, and public outrage reached a boiling point. Protesters flooded the streets, their chants growing louder and more determined. Marcus watched the news coverage from his living room, feeling a mix of vindication and anxiety. This was the moment they had been building toward, but it also felt like the calm before the storm. The police department announced an emergency press conference to address the mounting backlash. Marcus's father was invited to speak, but the invitation came with strings attached. "They want me to keep it civil," he told Marcus and his mom, shaking his head. "They're hoping to defuse the situation without taking real action." As the day of the press conference approached, the tension reached its peak. Marcus could feel it everywhere, in the somber looks exchanged by his parents, in the constant hum of news alerts on his phone, in the faces of his friends and neighbors who had come to support him. On the morning of the press conference, Marcus stood by his father's side as they prepared to leave for the event. "You ready?" his dad asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Marcus nodded, his resolve unwavering. "I'm ready," he said, knowing this was the moment everything had been leading up to. As they stepped outside, the crowd waiting for them erupted into cheers of support. Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, people who had come together not just for him, but for a cause much bigger than any one person. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was to come. The press conference was about to begin, and the world was watching. As Marcus and his father walked onto the stage at the press conference, the energy in the room was electric. The crowd outside could be heard chanting, their voices united in a demand for justice. Cameras flashed, reporters jotted down notes, and everyone waited to hear what would be said. Marcus stayed close to his dad, his heart pounding as he scanned the room. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that this moment would change everything. The chief of police, flanked by senior officers, stepped up to the podium first. He began with a carefully worded statement, one that danced around responsibility and focused instead on vague promises to review policies and rebuild trust. Marcus could feel the tension in the air as the crowd murmured in dissatisfaction. His dad stood nearby, his expression calm but intense, waiting for his turn to speak. But just as his father stepped forward, a commotion erupted near the back of the room. A man in plain clothes had stood up, waving a folder and shouting, "This is a cover-up," he yelled, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent as security moved toward him, but the man held his ground, his face determined. "They're hiding the truth about what really happened that day." Marcus froze, his eyes darting to his father, who looked just as startled. The man introduced himself as a former officer who had recently left the force, and what he said next sent shockwaves through the room. "Those officers weren't just targeting Marcus because of racial bias," he declared. "They were acting on orders. They were told to target anyone who didn't fit their so-called profile for the neighborhood." Gasps filled the room as reporters scrambled to take notes and ask questions. The chief of police's face turned pale, his calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. Marcus's dad stepped forward, seizing the moment. "If this is true," he said, his voice strong and steady, "then this is bigger than just a few bad officers. This is systemic." The former officer nodded. "It's true," he said, "and I have proof." He held up the folder, which he claimed contained internal emails and memos outlining discriminatory practices within the department. The crowd erupted into chaos as the press clamored for details, and security eventually escorted the man out of the room. Marcus felt his pulse racing as he processed what had just happened. The focus of the story had shifted dramatically. What had started as a fight for accountability for his personal experience had now uncovered a deeper, more insidious issue within the police department. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about an entire system that had been built on bias and injustice. As the press conference continued, the chief of police struggled to regain control of the narrative. He announced that an independent investigation would be launched into the department's practices, but his words felt hollow. The damage was already done. The seeds of doubt and outrage had been planted, and they were growing fast. That night, Marcus and his family returned home to find reporters camped outside their house, eager for a statement. His father addressed them briefly, reiterating the need for transparency and justice, but Marcus stayed inside, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. He sat in his room, scrolling through social media, where the story had already gone viral. The former officer's claims had sparked a wave of reactions. Some people were shocked and angry, demanding immediate action. Others were skeptical, dismissing the allegations as an attempt to discredit law enforcement. Marcus couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: validation, frustration, and a renewed sense of determination. Over the next few days, more details began to emerge. The former officer's claims were backed by additional evidence, including testimony from other whistleblowers who had decided to come forward. The memos revealed a pattern of targeting minority communities under the guise of keeping the neighborhoods safe. The outrage grew louder, and protests swelled in size. But the revelations also brought new risks. Marcus's family received more threats, some even more frightening than before. His parents tried to shield him from the worst of it, but he could see the worry in their eyes. The fight for justice was taking a toll on all of them, but there was no turning back now. One evening, as Marcus sat with his parents in the living room, his dad received a phone call. He stepped into the kitchen to take it, and when he returned, his face was grim. "That was the journalist," he said. "There's more. She found evidence that links this to higher-ups in the department, people who knew what was happening and let it continue." Marcus's mom gasped. "How far does this go?" she asked, her voice trembling. His dad shook his head. "We're about to find out." The next day, the journalist published a bombshell report exposing the extent of the corruption. It detailed how senior officials had ignored complaints, buried evidence, and even encouraged discriminatory practices to maintain a certain image for the town. The report named names, and the fallout was immediate. The town was in an uproar. Protests turned into marches, with people demanding resignations and criminal charges. Marcus felt a sense of both fear and hope as he watched the community rally together. This was the fight they had been waiting for, but it was also the most dangerous part of the journey. As the tension reached its peak, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. The stakes had never been higher, and the fight for justice was far from over. But he knew one thing for sure: the truth was out, and there was no going back. The town was holding its breath. The fallout from the journalist report had sent shockwaves through every corner of the community. The police department was in shambles, with calls for resignations and criminal investigations growing louder by the day. Protests outside City Hall became a daily occurrence, and the tension was palpable. Marcus and his family had stayed relatively quiet in the days following the bombshell report, unsure of what the next move would be. Then, one morning, everything changed. The district attorney announced a public hearing to address the allegations against the police department. It would be an open forum, with victims, whistleblowers, and community leaders invited to testify. The news sent ripples through the town, and Marcus's father was among those asked to speak. The night before the hearing, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his parents, going over what his dad planned to say. "This is our chance to make them listen," his father said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Marcus nodded, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. He didn't know what would happen, but he knew this was a moment they couldn't back away from. When the day of the hearing arrived, the atmosphere was electric. The courtroom was packed, with standing room only, and the press filled every available space. Outside, a large crowd gathered, holding signs and chanting for justice. Marcus and his family sat near the front, their hearts pounding as the proceedings began. One by one, people took the stand to share their stories. Whistleblowers detailed the corruption within the department, victims recounted their experiences of racial profiling, and community leaders called for accountability. Each testimony painted a damning picture of a system built on bias and abuse of power. When it was Marcus's father's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He stood tall and composed, his presence commanding attention. "I'm here today, not just as a father, but as a member of this community," he began. "What happened to my son was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that has been allowed to operate without accountability for far too long." His words were powerful, and Marcus felt a surge of pride as he watched his dad speak with conviction. But just as the hearing seemed to be reaching its peak, an unexpected twist unfolded. A woman in the back of the room stood up, holding a thick envelope. "I have additional evidence," she announced, her voice trembling but firm. All eyes turned to her as she made her way to the front and handed the envelope to the district attorney. "This was sent to me anonymously," she explained. It contains records, emails, and documents that go even deeper than what's already been revealed. The district attorney opened the envelope and began flipping through the pages, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "This changes everything," he finally said, his voice heavy with meaning. He motioned to one of his aides, who quickly left the room. The hearing was briefly paused as the new evidence was reviewed, and the room buzzed with speculation. Marcus and his parents exchanged uncertain glances, wondering what could possibly be in those documents. When the proceedings resumed, the district attorney addressed the crowd. "The evidence we've just received implicates individuals at the highest levels of leadership in this town," he announced. "This goes beyond the police department. It reveals a network of corruption that has touched nearly every aspect of our local government." The room erupted in shock. Reporters scrambled to update their stories, and the crowd outside began chanting even louder. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he processed the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about the police anymore, it was about an entire system that had betrayed its community. The climax of the day came when arrest warrants were announced for several key officials, including the police chief and a prominent city council member. The news sent a clear message: no one was above the law. As the officials were escorted out in handcuffs, the crowd outside cheered, their voices echoing through the streets. For Marcus, it was a moment of both relief and disbelief. The fight for justice had been long and grueling, but they had finally reached a turning point. His family stood together, holding on to each other as the weight of the day settled in. But just as they were preparing to leave, another unexpected twist emerged. A young reporter approached Marcus and his dad, her face filled with a mix of excitement and urgency. "I've been investigating the anonymous tip that led to today's evidence," she said, "and I think I know who sent it." Marcus and his father exchanged a curious glance. "Who?" his dad asked cautiously. The reporter hesitated for a moment before answering. "It came from someone inside the system, someone who wanted to take it down from within. They haven't revealed their identity yet, but they left a note. It said, 'The truth must come out, no matter the cost.'" The revelation left Marcus and his family speechless. Somewhere, someone had risked everything to expose the truth. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of systems, there were people willing to do the right thing. As they walked out of the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers once again. Marcus looked around at the faces of the people who had stood by him, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. The fight wasn't over, but they had won a significant battle. And as the sun set over the town, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice and accountability would finally take root. As Marcus and his family left the courthouse that evening, the weight of everything they had endured started to feel a little lighter. The chants of the crowd followed them as they walked toward their car, their faces a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. It wasn't just their fight anymore, it belonged to the entire community. On the drive home, the car was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. Marcus stared out the window, watching the streets pass by, streets that now felt different. They weren't just places he knew, they were symbols of everything they had been fighting for. His father finally broke the silence. "I'm proud of you," he said, glancing at Marcus in the rearview mirror. Marcus looked up, surprised. "Me?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Yes, you," his dad replied. "This started with what happened to you. You didn't let it crush you. Instead, you turned it into something bigger. You gave people a reason to stand up." Marcus sat back, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions. He had spent so much time feeling powerless, but hearing those words made him realize just how much had changed. That night, the family sat together in their living room, the TV on but mostly ignored. News channels were replaying clips from the hearing, dissecting every detail. Marcus's mom reached for the remote and turned it off. "Enough of that for tonight," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Let's just be here together." They talked late into the night, reflecting on everything that had happened. They shared memories, fears, and hopes for what might come next. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they could breathe. In the days that followed, the community began to change in small but significant ways. The interim police chief announced sweeping reforms, including new training programs and independent oversight committees. While some were skeptical, others saw it as a step in the right direction. The town itself felt different too. People seemed more united, more willing to speak up for what was right. Marcus returned to school, where he was greeted with a mix of support and curiosity. Some classmates treated him like a hero, while others didn't know what to say. But Marcus didn't mind. He had grown in ways he hadn't expected, and he felt ready to face whatever came next. One day, as he walked home from school, he passed the park where everything had started. He stopped for a moment, standing near the spot where he had been confronted by the officers. The memories came flooding back, but this time they didn't feel as overwhelming. Instead, they felt like a reminder of how far he had come. As he stood there, a man approached him. Marcus recognized him as one of the organizers of the protests. "Hey," the man said, smiling warmly. "I just wanted to say thank you. What you and your family did, it mattered. It changed things." Marcus nodded, feeling a surge of pride. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady. Life didn't go back to normal. It became something new. The revelations from the hearing led to more investigations, exposing corruption that stretched far beyond their town. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when it felt like progress was too slow, but the community kept pushing. Marcus and his family stayed involved, attending meetings, speaking out, and supporting others who had been affected by the system's failures. One evening, months later, Marcus sat at his desk, scrolling through an article about the latest reforms in the police department. His phone buzzed with a message from the journalist who had first brought their story to light. "Just wanted to let you know," it read, "the anonymous whistleblower has reached out again. They say they're proud of what's happening in your town." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of connection to the mysterious figure who had played such a crucial role in their journey. He didn't know who they were, but he hoped they felt the impact of what they had done. The journey had changed Marcus in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself speaking out more, not just about what had happened to him, but about the broader issues of justice and equality. He joined a youth group focused on activism, where he met others who shared his passion for change. Together, they worked on projects to educate and empower their peers, turning their pain into purpose. One night, as the family sat down for dinner, Marcus's mom looked around the table and smiled. "You know," she said, "it's amazing how something so terrible could lead to so much good." Marcus's dad nodded. "It's not over," he said, "but we've come a long way." Marcus thought about everything they had been through, the fear, the anger, the uncertainty, and realized his dad was right. They had come a long way, and while the road ahead was still challenging, they were stronger for it. The story of their fight for justice became a beacon for others. It was shared across the country, inspiring communities to stand up against injustice in their own ways. Marcus's name became synonymous with resilience and hope, but he never saw himself as a hero. He was just a kid who had been pushed too far, who had decided to fight back with the support of his family and his community. As the sun set over their town one evening, Marcus sat on the porch with his parents, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The air was calm, the chaos of the past months finally giving way to a sense of peace. "We did good," his dad said, breaking the silence. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said softly, "we did." The fight for justice wasn't over. Not for their town, not for the world. But in that moment, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And with hope came the belief that change, no matter how difficult, was always possible. The next day, Marcus's father made a few phone calls. He wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it came to his family. He contacted the police department, demanding an explanation and accountability. He also reached out to a local community leader, someone who had been advocating for police reform for years. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," he told Marcus later that evening. What happened to you was wrong, but we can use this moment to make a difference." Marcus listened intently, feeling a spark of hope amidst the anger and confusion. He didn't fully understand what his father had planned, but he trusted him. He knew his dad wasn't just a man who reacted, he was a man who took action. As the days passed, word of the incident spread throughout the community. People started talking about what had happened, sharing their own experiences and frustrations. It became clear that Marcus's story wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed. Marcus began to see himself not just as a victim, but as a voice for change. With his father's guidance, he started speaking out, sharing his story with others. It wasn't easy, reliving the experience was painful, but he knew it was important. Through it all, Marcus's father stood by him, offering support and wisdom. "You have a voice, Marcus," he said one evening. "And when you use it, people listen. Don't ever forget that." The tension from that day still lingered, but it was slowly transforming into something more powerful, a sense of purpose. Marcus realized that while the world could be unfair, it was also full of people willing to stand up for what's right. And with his father by his side, he knew he had the strength to be one of them. In the days that followed, the incident hung over Marcus like a storm cloud that wouldn't dissipate. At school, word had spread quickly. Some of his classmates asked him about what had happened, their eyes wide with curiosity or disbelief. Others, especially those who had faced similar experiences, gave him quiet nods of solidarity. For the first time, Marcus realized just how many people around him carried the same invisible weight he now felt. One afternoon, while sitting in the lunchroom, his best friend Tyler leaned over the table. "Man, I saw the video online," he said, his voice low but urgent. "My older brother shared it. Everyone's talking about it." Marcus looked up, startled. "The video?" he asked. Tyler nodded. "Yeah, someone in the crowd filmed the whole thing. It's all over social media now. People are mad, Marcus. Like, really mad." Marcus didn't know how to feel about that. On one hand, he was glad people were paying attention to what had happened. But on the other hand, having his most humiliating moment out there for everyone to see made him feel exposed. He had barely processed the event himself, and now it was a public spectacle. That evening, when he got home, he found his parents sitting at the kitchen table. His mom's phone was in her hand, her face a mix of concern and resolve. "The video's gone viral," she said, looking at him. "People are calling and messaging us non-stop." Marcus's father leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This could be a turning point," he said. "People are paying attention. We have a chance to push for change." But not everyone who saw the video was supportive. By the next day, Marcus started noticing hateful comments popping up online. Some accused him of exaggerating the story, while others defended the officers' actions, claiming they were just doing their job. Marcus didn't understand how anyone could watch the video and still think he was in the wrong. One comment in particular stayed with him. It read, "If he wasn't doing anything wrong, why didn't he just comply?" The words echoed in his mind, making his frustration boil over. He had complied. He had done everything they asked, and it still wasn't enough. His father noticed his mood that evening as Marcus sat silently in the living room, scrolling through his phone. "Don't let those comments get to you," he said, sitting down beside him. "There will always be people who refuse to see the truth. Focus on the ones who are listening." Marcus nodded but didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to shake off the negativity. It felt unfair that he had to justify his innocence while the officers who had wronged him faced no consequences. Meanwhile, his father was working tirelessly behind the scenes. He had arranged a meeting with the police department to address the incident and demand accountability. He also connected with local community leaders to organize a town hall meeting, giving people a space to share their stories and voice their concerns.